Imagine a dimly lit room. Two people sit across from each other, a candle flickering between them. To the naked eye, this is a first date, the beginning of a promise. But if we adjust our lens to the frequency of the unconscious, the room is crowded. Standing behind the man is a towering spectral figure of his repressed feminine, his anima. Behind the woman, a stern, haunting architect of her masculine, her animus. These are the invisible guests. They are the ones actually negotiating the contract. The tragedy of the human condition is that we believe we are choosing our partners, while in reality, we are merely being recruited by our own shadows to play a role in a play we never agreed to write. This is the mystery of the doomed relationship. It is not an accident of timing or a flaw in character. It is a manifestation of the internal architecture of the psyche. Carl Jung once suggested that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Nowhere is this more devastatingly true than in our romantic attachments. We are drawn to certain individuals with a magnetic intensity that defies logic. This intensity is the first warning sign. It is the mirage, a psychic projection where we see our own missing pieces reflected in the eyes of a stranger. We must view the psyche not as a static thing, but as a complex mechanism, grinding in the dark. When we meet someone who fits the jagged edges of our own unhealed wounds, the gears lock. It feels like soulmate recognition. It feels like home. But for many, home was a place of conflict, neglect, or unresolved tension. Therefore, the soul recognizes the familiar scent of a coming storm and mistakes it for sunshine. This is the trail, the scent of the shadow. We are not falling in love with a person. We are falling in love with a mirror that promises to show us the parts of ourselves we have buried in the abyss. Consider the metaphor of the labyrinth. Most enter a relationship looking for the exit for the peace of the garden, but Jungian thought suggests that the relationship is the labyrinth itself. The walls are built from our projections. We do not see the partner. We see a screen upon which we project our internal gods and demons. As long as the projection holds, the relationship feels magical. But the weight of a human soul cannot support the weight of a god. Eventually the projection cracks. The gold peels away to reveal the lead beneath. This is the moment the doom manifests, yet it was there, woven into the very first hello. Why are we condemned to this alchemy of pain? Is there a code to break the cycle, or are we merely actors in a recursive dream? To understand why the end is written in the beginning, we must look closer at the mechanism of the shadow, the silent partner in every kiss and every argument. Before we descend further into the mechanics of this psychic trap, I invite you to join this circle of seekers. If you find yourself questioning the invisible forces that govern your life, consider becoming part of this community. Here, we do not seek easy answers. We seek the courage to look into the dark. Subscribe, and let us continue the descent together. The question remains, if your heart is being guided by a ghost you cannot see, how can you ever hope to find a love that is real? The answer lies in the mechanism of the shadow and the terrifying realization that the person you love might not exist at all. The tragedy of the doomed relationship is rarely found in the absence of love, but in the presence of a profound unconscious collusion. To understand why we are magnetically drawn to the very people who will eventually break us, we must examine the internal architecture of the Anima and Animus. These are not merely poetic concepts, they are the fundamental gears of our romantic perception. Jung viewed the anima in a man and the animus in a woman as the bridge to the collective unconscious's psychic blueprint of the opposite gender, formed by history, biology, and the haunting echoes of the first caregivers. When you meet someone and feel that electric spark, you are not witnessing a connection between two humans. You are witnessing a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence where your internal blueprint finds a temporary home in the body of another. This is the mirage. You do not see the human standing before you. You see your own repressed soul draped over them like a luminous veil. This is why the beginning feels like a religious experience. You are finally whole, but it is a borrowed wholeness. It is an alchemy of the ego that cannot sustain its own weight. As the months pass, the code of the shadow begins to reveal itself. The shadow is everything you have denied about yourself, your aggression, your vulnerability, your hidden greed, or your stifled power. Because it is too painful to own these traits, you project them onto your partner. The person you once worshipped as a savior slowly transforms into a jailer. This is the trail of the shadow. You begin to despise in them the very things you cannot accept in yourself. If you are someone who suppresses your own anger to remain good, you will be magnetically drawn to someone who expresses that anger with volatility. You believe you are trying to fix them, but your unconscious is actually trying to live through them. In the modern landscape of digital isolation and existential vacuum, this mechanism has become even more lethal. We live in an age of curated personas, making the fall into projection faster and more violent. We are lonelier than ever, and in that abyss, we reach out for anyone who can provide a temporary reprieve from the void. We mistake the intensity of a trauma bond for the depth of intimacy. We find ourselves in relationships that feel doomed because they were never built on the reality of the other person. They were built on the desperate need to find a container for our own discarded pieces. This is the mechanism of the repetition compulsion. We repeat the cycle because the unconscious is trying to force a resolution. It brings us back to the scene of the crime. to the same type of person, hoping that this time we will integrate the shadow rather than be consumed by it. But without the light of awareness, we are merely ghosts haunting our own lives. We find ourselves asking, why does this always happen to me? While ignoring the fact that we are the common denominator in every shipwreck. The architecture of your pain is not a prison sentence, though it feels like one. It is a map. The friction you feel in a failing relationship, the constant arguments, the inexplicable withdrawal, the feeling of being unseen is the sound of the projection cracking. It is the psyche's way of demanding that you look away from the partner and into the mirror. The doom isn't in the relationship itself, but in the refusal to recognize that the person across from you is a stranger you have dressed in your own clothes. We must ask ourselves, what part of my own soul have I delegated to this person? What alchemy am I trying to perform by using their body as a laboratory for my own transformation? The answer is often terrifying. It suggests that most of what we call love is actually a sophisticated form of self-avoidance. As we stand at the edge of this realization, we face the most difficult transition of the Jungian path, the withdrawal of projection. It is the moment where the mirage vanishes, and we are left standing in the desert of the abyss, forced to confront the truth of our own solitude. The mechanism is grinding to a halt, the mirage is fading, and in the silence that remains, the real work begins. The collapse of a projection is a violent event. It is the moment the mirage dissolves, leaving you in the cold light of reality, staring at a partner who suddenly feels like a stranger. Most people flee at this stage. They believe the love has died, when in truth, the possibility for real love has only just begun. This is where we move from the doomed cycle into the alchemy of the self. To save oneself from the repetition of the abyss, one must undergo a process of psychological distillation, a painful separation of what belongs to you and what belongs to the person across from you. The first step in this practical alchemy is the withdrawal of projection. This is not a conversation you have with your partner. It is a ritual of the soul. You must look at the traits in your partner that trigger your deepest resentment or your most desperate longing and ask, where does this live in me? If you are haunted by their coldness, you must find the architecture of your own internal winter. If you are repulsed by their weakness, you must descend into the abyss of your own hidden fragility. This is the code of transformation. By reclaiming these parts, you stop using the other person as a container for your discarded self. You begin to dismantle the mechanism that has kept you locked in a cycle of mutual destruction. This transition requires a terrifying honesty. It is the realization that the perfect partner you were seeking was actually an internal archetype, the Anima or Animus trying to be born within your own psyche. Jungian thought teaches us that the goal of a relationship is not happiness, but individuation. The partner is the trace, the scent that leads you back to your own soul. When you stop demanding that your partner be your savior, your mother, your father, or your god, the doom begins to lift. You are no longer two ghosts colliding in the dark. You become two conscious beings standing side by side, acknowledging the vast, untamed wilderness between you. To apply this, one must practice the observation of the trigger. When the familiar heat of an argument begins to rise, or when the mirage of a new infatuation starts to blind you, you must pause. You must recognize that your unconscious is attempting to perform a synchronicity of old wounds. In that silence, you ask, what internal void am I asking this person to fill? This is the hard, gritty work of the alchemical marriage. It is the integration of the shadow where you take responsibility for your own darkness rather than punishing your partner for reflecting it back to you. The architecture of a conscious relationship is built on the ruins of the romantic ideal. It is less like a fairy tale and more like a sacred fire that burns away everything that is not authentic. If a relationship feels doomed from the start, it is because it was built on a foundation of mirages. The only way to break the curse is to die to the image you have created of the other person. You must allow the God you fell in love with to die so that the human being standing in front of you can finally be seen. As we reach the end of this descent, we realize that the invisible guests were never the enemy. The shadow, the anima, the animus, these are the messengers of our own wholeness. They disrupt our lives and sabotage our romances only because we refuse to listen to their code. When we finally turn toward the dark, the abyss stops being a place of falling and becomes a place of birth. The door to the room is still dimly lit. The candle still flickers, but as you look across the table, the spectral figures have vanished. There is no more mechanism of fate grinding you into the dust. There is only you and the other, and the terrifying, beautiful silence of a choice. Will you love the reflection, or will you finally have the courage to love the human? The alchemy is now in your hands. The script is no longer pre-written. The pen is yours, but the ink is your own blood, and the paper is the remaining days of your life. Look into the mirror one last time. The person staring back is the only one who can break the cycle. The mystery was never about finding the right person. It was about becoming the person who no longer needs a mirror to feel whole. The mirage is gone, the abyss is open, and for the first time, you are truly awake.